You're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. Coming up on today's programme, Johnson's call to the world. The Prime Minister urges humankind to grow up and come of age at November's COP26 summit. Mr Johnson also took issue with Kermit the Frog for the Muppets' insistence that it's not easy being green. In our daily debate, we'll ask which of the two of them is right. And we'll go behind the doors of the Merseyside school that's leading the drive to make students aware of climate change and the ways to tackle it. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. And first of all, congratulations if you stayed up until the small hours of this morning to watch Boris Johnson address the United Nations General Assembly. If you didn't, don't worry, we'll be looking at it in some detail for you now. So the Prime Minister urged humankind to grow up and come of age ahead of November's COP26 climate summit in Glasgow, which he reiterated would concentrate on 4 central themes.
We need all countries, every single one of you, to step up and commit to very substantial reductions by 2030. And I'm absolutely convinced, I passionately believe, that we can do it by making commitments in 4 areas. And I want you to remember them: coal, cars, cash and trees. Coal, cars, cash and trees. It's very simple.
So let's take a look then at those 4 key areas that need tackling. Firstly, coal. Now, the Prime Minister wants countries to end their support of the fossil fuel. He called on world leaders to phase out their use of coal power, both at home and overseas.
Thank very much President Xi of China for what he has just done to end China's international financing of coal. And I hope China will now go further and phase out the domestic use of coal as well. Wouldn't that be a great thing? Because the experience of the UK shows that it can be done.
Well, next up is cars. And Mr Johnson has said he wants other countries to follow the UK's lead and commit to phasing out the sale of new petrol and diesel vehicles. The UK has promised to do this by 2030.
We call on the world to come together to drive this market in a low-carbon way, drive this market so that by 2040 there are only zero-emission vehicles on sale anywhere in the world.
Cash is another big priority for the Prime Minister. He's asked the world's richest nations to recommit to spend £1 billion a year to help the rest of the world tackle climate change. And several countries announced that they would increase their climate finance commitments during the UN General Assembly.
I'm very pleased and encouraged by some of the pledges we've heard here at UNGA, including from Denmark, and now a very substantial commitment from the United States that brings us within touching distance of that $100 billion pledge that we need every year.
And finally, trees. The Prime Minister is asking leaders to work together to reverse the loss of trees and biodiversity across the world. And he's asked leaders to follow the example of Pakistan's President Imran Khan, who's pledged to plant 10 billion trees in his country.
We need to halt and reverse the loss of trees and biodiversity by 2030. Halt and reverse the loss of trees by 2030. That's what we should do a pledge to do that at the COP in just 40 days' time.
So that's the thrust of Boris Johnson's pitch ahead of the summit, which is now just 39 days away. But are his fellow world leaders likely to listen? Let's see what our climate change correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter thinks. So, Hannah, Boris Johnson there wanting commitments and action from world leaders. So will they have taken notice?
They might well have done. I think there's definitely a sense, if you speak to people involved in the negotiations, not just for the UK, but for other countries, that there is a renewed sense of momentum and optimism following that big new commitment from China to end international financing for coal and so on. But that there is a sense as well that there is a long way to go. We are 40 days away or so. And on coal, You know, China and India and Australia and Russia, big consumers and producers, are yet to reach agreement about how to phase out coal domestically. That's a big problem for developing nations. And then on cash, we're still $15 billion short of the $100 billion that was previously promised from rich nations to give to poorer nations in order for them to adapt to the worst effects of climate change. $15 billion is an obvious thing to say, is still a huge amount of money. So that's even with the big new US commitment. And it's hard to overstate really how important that funding shortfall is to developing nations who really aren't willing to consider embracing tougher carbon emissions targets, for example, until that funding gap has been closed. So there are some big problems there. And then if you look sort of more broadly, these negotiators know that they're still waiting for some 60 or so countries to bring forth their nationally determined contributions, which essentially is under the Paris Agreement an enhanced commitment to do more to reduce carbon emissions. That's called the ratchet mechanism. It's what all the countries, the 190 countries who signed the Paris Agreement, signed up for. They're supposed to be coming forward with these enhanced commitments. 60 of them haven't yet. And a big part of the Glasgow meeting is to get everyone to agree on global carbon markets. And there's been very little progress on that, a very sticky, thorny issue that's proving very hard to navigate.
And what about the way in which he delivered his pitch, Hannah? Very familiar Boris Johnson style, even referencing one of the Muppets. I mean, is that likely to cut through?
Well, it was the speech that launched 1,000 memes. I mean, the internet loved the Kermit the Frog analogy. In that way, it did cut through. And yes, it was very Boris Johnson, slightly meandering, slightly comical, and sometimes a little bit hard to follow. But you know, the government has form on this subject. Allegra Stratton, the Prime Minister's spokesperson for the COP26 meeting, recently came in for a lot of criticism when she did a couple of interviews and referred to how we can all make a difference by sort of not rinsing dishes before they go in the dishwasher, or freezing bread before it goes mouldy. And she was criticised for sort of diminishing the gravity of the issue. But actually, all of that didn't happen by accident. Allegra Stratton made those comments to keep the issue in the headlines, perhaps inviting ridicule, but getting people to think about how important climate change is and the part that ordinary people can play in tackling it. So I don't think it was an accident that Boris Johnson chose that strategy, and the way he delivered the speech certainly pushed it up to the top of the headlines. And I think the ancillary point is that there is a concern amongst world leaders and negotiators and scientists, actually, that there's alarm fatigue happening, that the warnings are so urgent and so diabolical, so catastrophic, that people are starting to switch off. So injecting a bit of humour into these things is no bad thing.
Hannah, thanks very much indeed. Well, as we've discussed, the Prime Minister told the UN then that Kermit the Frog was wrong when he complained that it wasn't easy being green. And on today's debate, we're going to be asking the founder of Climate in Colour, Joycelyn Longdon, and the director of Climate Imperative, Bruce Nillis, who they agree with, Mr Johnson or the Muppet. Now, a report published today suggests that Boris Johnson may still have his work cut out. It concluded that the vast majority of UK industries will miss their net zero emissions targets without urgent action from the government. The report by Zurich UK and the University of the West of England found only 5 of 17 sectors are decreasing their emissions, while 7 are actually seeing emissions rise. It wants the government to implement nationwide strategies to help industries overcome carbon challenges. And Mr Johnson's successor as London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, has warned that climate change is the biggest threat facing the capital right now. According to analysis by City Hall, nearly half of London's hospitals, 1 in 5 schools and a quarter of the city's railway stations are already at risk of flooding. Mr Khan said time is running out to tackle the climate crisis. Governments being urged to suspend funding for rainforest protection in the Democratic Republic of Congo until the country extends its logging ban. The DRC plans to lift a 19-year suspension on new industrial logging in the Congo Basin, the second largest rainforest in the world, and absorbs much more carbon than it releases. A global coalition of more than 40 non-governmental organisations says reopening the country's forests to loggers would be a disaster for the climate. And Ford is in talks to build a new generation of electric transmission systems, an essential part of electric cars, at its UK plant. Bosses are expected to make a decision within weeks about whether to build the new systems at Halewood on Merseyside. Ford says its passenger vehicle lineup in Europe will be all electric by 2030. Now, a Merseyside school has put climate change at the centre of its curriculum. And now St Vincent's in Liverpool, where most of the pupils are blind or deaf, is inspiring other schools in the region to go green. Imzman Rashid went to find out more from the school's teachers and students.
It may look like a typical school on the outskirts of Liverpool, but St Vincent's is having global impact.
Welcome to our polytunnel. So we've been growing tomatoes, we've been growing carrots. These apples are great.
Abiyan knows by the time he leaves school, climate change may have forced more than 100 million people into poverty, and being visually impaired doesn't stop him tackling the issue head on.
It makes me feel very bad that we're actually burning fossil fuel and making this earth hotter, and sometimes killing the animals and so on. It makes me feel a bit upset and wanting me to see if we can try and save the planet.
For the last decade, this school has been building climate action into its curriculum. And for some of its students, their activism has taken them as far as the United Nations. Now, they're set to share their green vision across the country.
As a specialist school, we can be freer in the curriculum. It means we can do things for climate action that colleagues can then replicate in their curriculum. Once we've piloted it, there is still a nervousness to move away from the SATs, but we have to. Hence, we can be a hub of best practice and we can share that with our colleagues.
It means a network across Merseyside will replicate St Vincent's successful education programme. They're also leading a group of nearly 500 schools that have pledged to go net zero by 2030.
Up and down the country, hundreds of schools are following the inspiring example of St Vincent and really responding to the calls of young people to preserve the planet for future generations. And children really get it. They just say, come on, world leaders, time that you took the action.
Put these in bags. And we're going to send these to COP26.
And in just over a month's time, these climate warriors will head to Glasgow, where they'll meet world leaders and offer them some seeds for change.
I'd say do it. Visually impaired and blind people are doing it. You better do it. Save our planet.
A stark message from a boy fighting to save a planet he can't even fully see. Now, he wants you to do the same. Imzman Rashid, Sky News, Liverpool.
Do stay with us. Coming up after the break, I'm going to be joined by the economist Joycelyn Longdon and Bruce Nillers, the director of climate think tank Climate Imperative. They're standing by, ready and waiting right now. We're going to be discussing whether it really is that easy for the UK economy to go green and how young people should learn about climate change. That's coming up.
The numbers were increasing even before the pandemic. So what we know is that children's mental health, unfortunately, has been getting worse, and it tends to be the most vulnerable who are most affected. For example, those living in poverty or in disability or who are socially excluded. But the pandemic really had a disastrous effect for some young people. We know that lots of children, young people had a tough time, but they've been resilient and they've bounced back. So this is not the majority. But for those, the school closures and the disruption, losing out on that structure and predictability and routine of school, the contact with friends, for some young people, school is also a place where their needs get picked up and where they can access support. So it's just had a really negative effect for some young people. And our services, which have never been funded properly to begin with, are just buckling under the demand. And what we usually want to do in children's mental health is to intervene as early as we can. We have effective treatments, and the earlier you intervene, the better. So I do really worry about children and young people who are waiting for treatment. And the worry is that certainly for some, the difficulties are just going to get worse. Because for some children and young people, they actually don't need that much help. They might just need 1 or 2 sessions with someone who can support them. But we then also need that link into specialist mental health services and to have enough trained clinicians to do this. The other place where children and young people are and can get help is at schools. And we're calling on the Education Secretary to prioritise this as a really urgent area of need. And we have mental health support teams being rolled out, but that needs to be accelerated. All schools need to be set up. When it's great to see children and young people back in school, and you can see how just getting back into their usual activities, seeing their friends, and also just seeing normal life being re-established is what they need. And it's also really helpful for them to see the adults in their lives becoming a little bit more relaxed about things, getting back into their normal activities. So, most children, young people will be absolutely fine. But it's really important also for parents to just keep tuned in, seeing how they're doing, noticing if there are any major changes in how their children are. If, for example, if they're just not coming out and talking to them and joining them at meal times, if they seem to have lost interest in school or activities, if they're suddenly really restricting their diet, it's just kind of keeping an eye on that, as it's so important.
We don't understand that every lake or a pond is a habitat in itself, which houses frogs, snakes, crabs, turtles, birds, so many different life forms. Human beings directly depend on underground water source. So a lake or a pond is necessary to replenish these groundwater resources.
Did you know if we use less energy, we can reduce air pollution? Like turning off the lights? Yep.
We've an east-west split on Friday, with western parts seeing a lot of low cloud, patchy drizzle, some light rain, and most eastern areas seeing some early brightness at least, and hanging on to the brightness parts of East Anglia and the southeast, where temperatures again could reach around 23 degrees Celsius, 73 degrees Fahrenheit, so still very warm for this time in September. Still quite a breezy day with the strongest winds in the far north, and those once again are going to help the air pollution levels stay low right across the country.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. And we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with the founder of Climate in Colour, Joycelyn Longdon, and Bruce Nilles, the Executive Director of Climate Imperative. So welcome to both of you. Really good to have you on the show. And first of all, Boris Johnson disagreed with a very famous Muppet in his address to the UN.
Kermit the Frog sang, "It's not easy being green." You remember that one? I want you to know that he was wrong.
So how easy is it to be green? Let's ask that to Joycelyn Longdon first of all. So Boris Johnson clearly trying to encourage other countries to go green, but is he right to say that it's the easy option?
I think my question would be, if it was so easy to be green, why Boris Johnson, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, has contributed £4 billion to the oil and gas industry? That's not very green. Why is he not cancelling the Campbell oil field up near Scotland? So if it is so easy to be green, why hasn't Boris Johnson himself made kind of the most pressing green decisions for this country?
Bruce, what do you make of that? Do you think that's fair? I mean, Boris Johnson would no doubt argue that the UK has a good record on cutting back on its dependence on coal. He'd say that they've got world-leading climate targets. They're going to announce their strategy on meeting them in the coming weeks. Do you think it's fair to criticise the UK's record on this? And should Boris Johnson actually get some credit for what's been achieved this week?
I think it's a story of two tales. One is, yes, there's progress, but there's a lot more needs to be done, right? If it was as easy as Jocelyn said, we wouldn't have this conversation. And so the opportunity we have is, how does Boris Johnson, how do governments around the world help people accelerate this transition from fossil fuels? Because it's not as easy as it should be to help transition to electric cars, to electric heat pumps. There's enormous things we can do, but we need the government to be helping make it easier than it is today.
OK, and so let's take a look, Jocelyn, shall we, at what that means for the consumer and how easy that could be. And we'll have a look at what Boris Johnson actually said. He said, we have nothing to fear and everything to gain from the green industrial revolution. So, Jocelyn, what do you think at the moment of how easy it is for a consumer to go green, and what will they gain?
I think there are some obvious changes that everyone can make that we've heard time and time again: eating less meat, taking more journeys by foot or by bike, flying less. And obviously those are quite easy actions to take. But the more infrastructural decisions that we have to make to be more green are in the hands of the government and are currently not as easy as they could be. We don't have an amazing and affordable transport network for people to, maybe not drive to work or depending on where they're living. And so I think there's a lot more to do infrastructurally from the government to make these decisions easier. So again, as Bruce said, it's a tale of two stories. There are some actions that we can take that are really simple, really easy, and everyone should be doing them. But there's a lot more to be done systematically.
Well, yes, and Bruce, do you agree with that? Is this down to governments to try and make some of these decisions more attractive and cheaper as well? Jocelyn was talking about transport, but there's also the cost of insulating and heating your homes as well, isn't there? Is it down to the government to make that cheaper and easier for us?
That's right. I mean, obviously, there's a lot we can do as individuals. We can do a lot of things in our daily life, but we're not going to solve this problem unless we get governments and businesses stepping up to make this easier for everybody. So as you're thinking about things like when your water heater breaks, is there a program in place to help people afford to make the transition to a clean, non-fossil fuel alternative? Those kind of programs rest with the government, helping make sure those programs are in place. And that's what we need across the world today so that we can get this problem solved in the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, and Jocelyn, Bruce mentioned corporations and companies there. What role does the private sector have?
The role of the private sector is to make sure that they are working in line with the targets that we have as a community. This takes all of us, and companies at the moment aren't taking so much responsibility and are more interested in greenwashing consumers instead of actually being truthful, being honest, and making the hard changes and the hard decisions that they will have to make in order for us to reach the goals that we need to.
Is it the truth, Bruce, that ultimately it's going to make good financial sense to go green? We heard Boris Johnson talking about it being the lucrative option. Is that true to say that that's ultimately going to help encourage businesses to take that course?
I think that's one of the most exciting developments in the last 5 to 10 years, which is the price of clean energy today is cheaper than fossil fuels. Thinking about the gas crisis in the UK and around Europe right now, the continued reliance on fossil fuels is terrible for our climate, but it's also terrible for our economy. So you see factories having to shut down because they can't afford to buy natural gas. That wouldn't happen if we had a clean, renewable economy. And so there's enormous upside today. The problem is we have private companies who are lobbying on behalf of oil and gas who are trying to slow down this transition. And currently the governments are listening to them more than the rest of us.
But Bruce, there are jobs in those industries as well, aren't there? And people are worried about losing those jobs.
Enormous. I grew up in the northwest England, and I go back to visit my mom, and it is amazing to see the wind turbines, right? Those are real jobs, making steel, putting them in the ground and operating them. So yes, there are enormous upsides economically, but also for the job transition so that people have good family supporting wages.
OK, let's move on to our second subject, shall we? Because just before the break, we saw a rather inspiring piece about a school in Merseyside with students there taking the lead on climate change and inspiring other children in the region. So we want to ask the question, how should we be teaching about climate change? And Bruce, I'm going to start with you on this. Should climate change be part of the curriculum? You're in the United States at the moment. What happens there at the moment?
So this year has been, the climate change has been coming through the front door like a battering ram, right? 1 in 3 Americans has been impacted by climate change this year, either superstorms or wildfires. And I have an 8-year-old daughter. She reads the headlines, she understands something is wrong. And so it is critical we help explain to our children the science of climate change. Why is it happening? And what do we need to do to solve it so that they, as they become voters and actors in the future, that they are a part of the solution and understand what we need to do to help solve this problem. So education is absolutely critical. I didn't learn about climate change until I went to university. That's too late. We need everyone, including our children in high school or grammar school, to be helping solve this problem today.
Joycelyn, what do you think about this? Because I just want to show one statistic to our viewers. 1 in 5 children in the UK reports nightmares about climate change. I mean, it's a difficult subject to broach, isn't it, with young children, when some of the news around it seems quite scary.
Yeah, and as Bruce says, children they're not hidden. They're not, they read the news, they understand what's going on. And it's actually up to us, the adults, the schools, their parents, to support them on that journey and to be honest with them about what is going on and why it's happening. And I think a huge part of alleviating this anxiety is actually taking action and being able to see adults, their leaders, governments take action and actually sit in their roles of making positive change. That is going to be inspiring and that is going to be empowering. And it is going to take away from this huge amount of fear that there is right now, because that fear is coming, it's stemming a lot from this helplessness and this overwhelm that things aren't going to get better.
Well, one way that children have actually taken action that we've seen around the world is these school strikes, Bruce. I mean, do you approve of those? There are plenty of people here that worry that children shouldn't be missing out on vital education and missing days of school. And if they're going to have their voices heard, why not do it at the weekend?
Well, so one of my most important memories of growing up was, and similarly, a terrifying time during the nuclear disarmament debate in the 1970s and 1980s. One of the most impactful things was going with my church group down to London and Hyde Park and urging the government to address the threat of nuclear war. Having children engaged, to me, was just a critical step of understanding it and also understanding that we can do something about it. So I'm a very big fan of inspiring children to engage in civic engagement so that they can be a part of shaping the future.
And Joycelyn, another quick word from you on that. Do you think children should be allowed time off school to go on marches, or should they be spending time in the classroom? Very briefly.
Yeah, I don't think all education happens in the classroom. You have to get out there. You have to be part of it. You have to know what's going on in politics. That is also learning. That is education for them. And so if that's what it takes to get our leaders to make action and to make children feel like they're part of the solution, then yeah, I think it's well worth the time.
OK, well, Joycelyn London and Bruce Nillis, really good to have you on the show. Thanks very much indeed for joining us here tonight.